2024 eclipse lasted 7 minutes and 31 seconds. Our calculations said 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Something fed on the extra time. I'm Father Marcello Galilei, yes, like the astronomer, family joke that stopped being funny when I actually ended up at the Vatican Observatory. Been here 8 years now, ever since my astronomy PhD thesis got, well, let's say the church offered a better career path than admitting I'd calculated something impossible about stellar drift patterns. The university called my work mathematically sound but physically impossible. Turns out they were half right. You have to understand, the Vatican Observatory isn't like regular parish work. We're 30 kilometers outside Rome, on the Pope's summer estate at Castel Gandolfo. Most days it's just me, Brother Domenico in the archives, and Sister Maria Celestina maintaining the equipment. Cardinal Alessandro Copernico visits monthly for administrative oversight, but mostly we watch the sky and file reports nobody reads. At least that's what I thought until 3 months ago. The eclipse was perfect for our instruments, total solar eclipse tracking across North America, best viewing conditions in decades. I'd been preparing for months, calibrating our telescopes, cross-referencing historical eclipse data from our archives. The Vatican Observatory has been tracking eclipses since 1582, We've got Gregorian's original calculations, handwritten notes from astronomers whose names you'd recognize if you studied the history of celestial mechanics. I was in the main observation dome at 2:14 p.m. local time, watching the live streams from Texas, when my hands started shaking. Not nerves, I've observed dozens of eclipses. This was different. The numbers were wrong. Our calculations, based on centuries of orbital mechanics, predicted totality would last 4 minutes and 12 seconds at the path center. Every major observatory agreed. NASA confirmed it. But as I watched the feeds from Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, totality kept going. And going. For minutes. 5 minutes. 6 minutes. I checked our atomic clocks, perfectly synchronized with UTC. I called the U.S. Naval Observatory on the emergency line. Their timing matched mine exactly. But on every camera feed, in every crowd of eclipse watchers, the shadow lingered like it was hungry. 7 minutes and 31 seconds. Then normal sunset progression, as if nothing had happened. By the time the eclipse ended, my migraine was so severe I could barely focus on the keyboard. That's when Cardinal Copernico arrived, not his usual monthly visit, but within hours of the eclipse ending. He drives a black Mercedes with Vatican plates. Usually takes him 45 minutes from Vatican City to Castel Gandolfo. Today he arrived in 23 minutes. I timed it. Father Galilei, he said, finding me hunched over the observation computers. I trust you'll record standard eclipse timing in your official report? I looked up at him. This man who'd hired me, who'd saved my career when my doctoral advisor called my stellar calculations mathematically impossible and theologically problematic. He was holding a leather folder I'd never seen before, the kind they use for classified Vatican documents. Cardinal, the eclipse duration was anomalous. We need to investigate, was it? He opened the folder. Inside were eclipse prediction charts I didn't recognize, calculations in a handwriting style I couldn't place. Old, maybe centuries old. According to these records, totality lasted exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I stared at the papers. The mathematics were familiar, similar to my failed thesis calculations. The ones that had suggested stellar positions sometimes shifted to accommodate something. The ones that had nearly ended my academic career. Where did these come from? The archives have many documents. Brother Domenico can show you the complete collection tomorrow. He closed the folder. Your official report will reflect standard eclipse duration. Understood. I wanted to argue. Should have argued. But I'd learned 8 years ago that questioning certain Vatican documents leads to uncomfortable conversations about faith versus empirical observation. Yes, Cardinal, that night I couldn't sleep. Not unusual, I suffer from chronic insomnia, occupational hazard of watching the night sky professionally. But this was different. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those extra minutes of darkness stretching across Texas, saw shadow lasting longer than orbital mechanics allowed. At 3:17 a.m., I gave up on sleep and walked to the secondary observation deck. It's smaller than the main dome, mostly used for routine stellar photography. But it has the best view of the gardens, and sometimes watching earthbound things helps when cosmic scales become overwhelming. That's when I saw the light, not starlight. I know every constellation visible from our latitude. This was coming from the gardens themselves, from the direction of the old chapel foundations. Everyone knows there used to be a small church on the grounds, demolished sometime in the 1950s for structural concerns. The foundation stones are still there, overgrown with ivy, mostly forgotten. But light was emanating from the ground where the altar would have been. I grabbed binoculars focused on the area. The light wasn't electric, too warm, too organic. It pulsed with a rhythm I couldn't identify, but something about it made my vision blur, like staring too long at an eclipse without proper filters. That's when I noticed my shadow. I was standing in a darkened observatory, with only minimal red lighting to preserve night vision. There shouldn't have been enough illumination to cast a clear shadow on the floor behind me. But there it was, sharp and distinct, and it was pointing toward the chapel ruins. I checked the time, 3:31 a.m. No eclipse anywhere on Earth. No unusual stellar events predicted. But my shadow was behaving like there was a light source behind me strong enough to cast clear definition across stone flooring. When I turned around, nothing. Just darkness and the faint red glow from the instrument panels. When I turned back toward the gardens, the light from the chapel foundations had vanished. But my shadow remained, still pointing toward those overgrown stones like a compass needle finding magnetic north. I stood there for 20 minutes, watching my impossible shadow, before the migraine returned so severely I had to retreat to my quarters. Sleep finally came around dawn, filled with dreams of clockwork mechanisms and celestial mathematics that made perfect sense until I woke up. The next morning, Brother Domenico found me in the archives before I'd even finished my first coffee. He's been at the observatory longer than anyone, 37 years of maintaining our historical records. Ancient man, probably in his 70s, but his memory for astronomical documents is flawless. Father Galilei, he said in his formal Italian-accented English, Cardinal Copernico mentioned you require access to our eclipse documentation. The complete collection, I confirmed, particularly anything relating to duration anomalies. His expression didn't change, but I noticed his hands tighten slightly on the document cart he was pushing. The special files. Special files. Eclipse observations requiring theological interpretation alongside astronomical measurement. He wheeled the cart to a reading table I'd never used before, positioned near a window that received no direct sunlight. These documents remain in the archives. No photocopying, no digital scanning, no removal from this room. The cart held maybe 30 folders, some modern, others bound in leather that looked genuinely medieval. The smell hit me immediately. Old parchment, but something else underneath. Something organic, like iron. I opened the first folder, Eclipse Observations from 1919, handwritten in Latin with astronomical charts that matched modern orbital calculations perfectly. Normal. The second folder was 1991. Same format, same precision. But there were margin notes in different handwriting, different ink. Notes like, duration exceeded calculation by 127 seconds, and entity manifestation confirmed during totality extension, and subject consumed 2.3 liters during feeding cycle. Entity manifestation. Subject consumed. I looked up at Brother Domenico. What kind of manifestation? That information requires higher authorization, he said, but his tone suggested he knew exactly what the notes meant. Cardinal Copernico will return this afternoon for your progress report. I spent the morning reading eclipse observations spanning 5 centuries. Most were standard astronomical documentation, but scattered throughout, maybe one in every 15 or 20 eclipses, were records of duration anomalies. Always extensions, never reductions. always accompanied by margin notes about manifestations or feeding periods or stellar corrections. The oldest folder was dated 1582, the year Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar. The handwriting was archaic, but the Latin was clear enough. Umbra lingered 7 minutes beyond calculation. The ancient thing grows stronger with each feeding. New calendar calculations may provide better containment precision through temporal manipulation of celestial events. Containment precision. Temporal manipulation. The Vatican Observatory wasn't just observing eclipses. We were calculating something that required active containment. And our calendar, the Gregorian calendar used by half the world, was designed partly as a supernatural management system. At 2:30 p.m., Cardinal Copernico returned as promised. I had maybe 50 questions prepared, but he spoke before I could begin. Father Galilei, your thesis 8 years ago suggested stellar positions occasionally shift to accommodate external influences. Do you still maintain those calculations were accurate? I hesitated. Those calculations had cost me my academic career, labeled as impossible by every peer reviewer. But sitting in archives full of eclipse anomalies, surrounded by 5 centuries of duration extensions, yes, I said, the mathematics were sound. Good. He sat across from me at the reading table. Then you'll understand that some astronomical phenomena require specialized protocols. The Church has maintained these protocols for nearly 500 years. What kind of protocols? Eclipse management. He opened a folder I hadn't seen, newer than the historical documents but older than modern records. There is a chapel on these grounds, Father Galilei. It opens only during eclipses, and there are rules. My shadow from the previous night suddenly made sense. The light from the foundation stones. The impossible pointing toward something that shouldn't exist. I saw the light last night, I admitted, from the old chapel ruins. Not ruins. Cardinal Copernico's expression remained neutral, but I caught something. Relief? Fear? The chapel foundation remains functional. What you saw was residual energy from the recent eclipse. The entity fed well. Entity. The same word from the margin notes. Cardinal. What exactly are we containing? Something that has been feeding on eclipse darkness since before the Church calculated its first calendar. Something that grows stronger with each anomalous extension. He closed the folder. Tomorrow night, there will be a partial lunar eclipse, visible from our latitude for approximately 43 minutes. The entity will be active, though weakened. And you will learn the rules, Father Galilei, because your astronomical expertise is required for proper containment protocols. He stood to leave, then paused. One preliminary rule: never enter the chapel grounds alone. Sister Maria Celestina will accompany you for tomorrow's observation. After he left, I sat in the archives until sunset, trying to process what I'd learned. The Vatican Observatory wasn't just studying celestial mechanics. We were managing something that fed on eclipse darkness, something that had been extending eclipse duration for centuries. My failed thesis suddenly felt less like academic failure and more like accidental discovery of something the Church had been hiding since 1582. That night, I didn't even attempt sleep. I stayed in the main observation dome, watching normal stellar positions, trying to calculate whether tomorrow's lunar eclipse would produce another duration anomaly. The mathematics suggested a minor extension, maybe 30 to 45 seconds beyond predicted timing. But as I worked through the calculations, I kept thinking about those margin notes. Entity manifestation confirmed. The ancient thing grows stronger. Stellar corrections. At 3:17 a.m., exactly 24 hours after the previous night's incident, I saw my shadow again. Same impossible definition, same pointing toward the chapel foundations. But this time, I could see the light source reflected in the observatory windows. It wasn't coming from the chapel ruins. It was coming from beneath them, underground. Tomorrow night, I would learn why the Vatican Observatory has been calculating eclipse anomalies for 5 centuries. Tomorrow night, I would meet the entity that feeds on stolen darkness. My migraine returned as I wrote these words, but I'm documenting everything now. If something happens during tomorrow's lunar eclipse, if the rules aren't sufficient for containment, someone needs to know that astronomical anomalies aren't natural phenomena. They're feeding schedules, and we've been keeping something very hungry, very well fed for a very long time. Sister Maria Celestina arrived at my quarters at 6:30 p.m., carrying a leather satchel that clinked with glass vials and metal instruments I didn't recognize. I'd expected her to look nervous. After all, we were about to confront whatever had been feeding on eclipse darkness for centuries. Instead, she appeared grimly professional, like a nurse preparing for surgery she'd performed dozens of times before. "Father Galilei," she said in her precise English, colored by what I'd always assumed was Northern Italian accent. "Cardinal Copernico says you've read the archive files." "Some of them." I grabbed my notebook and the eclipse timing calculations I'd been working on all day. "Sister, how long have you known about the chapel?" 17 years. Since my first assignment here." She opened her satchel, revealing glass containers filled with various liquids, some clear, others dark, one that seemed to absorb light entirely. "I maintain the astronomical instruments, yes? But also the containment equipment." Containment equipment. The clinical way she said it made my hands shake slightly. "What exactly are we containing?" "Come? You'll understand better when you see the chamber." We walked through the gardens toward the overgrown chapel foundations, and I noticed details I'd missed during my night observations. The ivy covering the stone ruins wasn't random. It formed specific patterns, almost like geometric designs. Mathematical spirals that reminded me of stellar orbit calculations. "Sister, those ivy patterns, planted in 1953, she said without breaking stride, when they demolished the above-ground chapel. The root systems follow astronomical alignments, stellar positions during significant eclipses throughout history. As we approached the foundation stones, I saw what I'd missed through binoculars. The light wasn't emanating from the ground level. There were gaps between the stones, and warm illumination was filtering up from below, like there was an entire structure beneath the visible ruins. Sister Maria Celestina knelt beside what would have been the altar area and pressed her hand against a stone carved with symbols I didn't recognize. Latin text, but older than medieval, maybe early Christian or even pre-Christian astronomical notations. The stone moved, not sliding, rotating like a combination lock mechanism. As it turned, I heard the unmistakable sound of precise clockwork engaging beneath us. "The Vatican Observatory has maintained this chamber since 1582, she explained as the ground opened to reveal stone steps descending underground. Pope Gregory XIII didn't just reform the calendar for civilian use. He calculated eclipse timing precision to manage what lives down here." We descended maybe 20 feet before emerging into a circular chamber that took my breath away. The walls were covered with astronomical charts dating back centuries, star maps, eclipse prediction tables, orbital calculation diagrams that made my failed thesis look elementary. But these weren't just historical documents. They were active working papers with fresh ink notations dated within the last few months. At the center of the chamber stood an altar that defied every principle of church architecture I'd ever studied. Instead of Christian symbols, it was carved with celestial mechanics, sun and moon phases, planetary alignments, mathematical formulas for calculating orbital periods. Around the altar's base were 7 glass vessels, each filled with a liquid that seemed to move independently of gravity. "This is the Eclipse Chapel," Sister Maria Celestina said, setting her satchel on a stone ledge carved into the wall. "It opens only during eclipse events because that's when the entity can manifest physically enough to require feeding." "Feeding on what?" "Eclipse duration." She lifted one of the glass vessels from the altar, the one filled with light-absorbing liquid. "Every time an eclipse lasts longer than calculated, the excess temporal darkness gets stored here. The entity feeds on stolen time." I stared at the vessel. The liquid inside wasn't moving like normal fluid. It was writhing, almost alive. Sister, this is impossible. You can't store time in physical containers, can't you? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Your thesis suggested stellar positions shift to accommodate external influences. What do you think those influences are? The implications hit me like a physical blow. My academic calculations hadn't been theoretical failures. They'd been accidental documentation of something that was actively manipulating celestial mechanics. Something that could extend eclipse duration by forcing stellar positions to shift microscopically. How long has this been happening? According to our oldest records, since approximately 325 AD, when the Council of Nicaea established fixed Easter dating based on lunar calculations. She moved to a wall chart showing eclipse patterns over the past 2 millennia. The Church learned that precise calendar management could predict and partially control when the entity would be strongest. I studied the chart. Every major eclipse with documented duration anomalies corresponded to periods of significant Church history. The eclipse of 1919 had lasted nearly 6 minutes beyond calculation, right after World War I, when global faith was at its lowest. The 1991 anomaly had coincided with the Soviet Union's collapse, another period of massive religious upheaval. It feeds on periods when human faith is disrupted, I realized. When people lose belief in cosmic order. Clever. Sister Maria Celestina began removing instruments from her satchel, astrolabes, but designed with moving parts I'd never seen in any historical collection. But not entirely accurate. It feeds on eclipse darkness specifically. Faith disruption just makes the feeding more efficient. The partial lunar eclipse was scheduled to begin in 47 minutes. According to my calculations, totality would last approximately 12 minutes, with the moon entering umbral shadow at 9:23 p.m. local time. Standard lunar eclipse, nothing unusual predicted by any major observatory. But the glass vessels around the altar were beginning to glow with anticipation. Sister, those containers, 7 phases of eclipse management, she explained, checking each vessel systematically. Penumbral entry, umbral contact, totality beginning, maximum eclipse, totality ending, umbral exit, penumbral departure. Each phase requires different containment protocols. She handed me a laminated card with text I could barely read in the chamber's strange lighting. The rules, Father Galilei. Memorize them now because during eclipse events, written text becomes unreliable. I held the card closer to one of the glowing vessels, using its light to read. Eclipse Chapel Protocols, Lunar Events. Enter chamber exactly 17 minutes before penumbral contact. Never earlier, never later. During penumbral phase, maintain constant prayer rotation. Latin only. No vernacular languages permitted. Upon umbral contact, begin stellar alignment corrections using astrolabe. Compensate for temporal displacement. Totality phase, absolute silence. No human voice. No breathing sounds above whisper level. Maximum eclipse, feed entity using prepared vessels. Pour clockwise, never counterclockwise. Totality ending, resume prayer rotation immediately. Continue until umbral exit. Departure, exit chamber before penumbral phase ends. Lock mechanism engages automatically. Sister, what happens if we violate these rules? She was calibrating one of the astrolabes, adjusting components that seemed to move independently of her input. Rule violations extend eclipse duration unpredictably. Father Lorenzo in 2003 used modern eclipse calculations instead of our historical corrections. The lunar eclipse lasted 3 hours beyond prediction, and Rome experienced temporal displacement for 6 days. Clocks ran backward randomly. Sunrise occurred at different times in different neighborhoods. People aged weeks in single afternoons. She looked up from the astrolabe. The Vatican spent considerable resources convincing the world it was mass hysteria caused by unusual solar radiation. My hands were definitely shaking now. How many people know about this? Active knowledge? Perhaps 12 individuals worldwide. Cardinal Copernico, myself, Brother Domenico who maintains the archives, 3 other Vatican observatory locations that monitor eclipse events in different hemispheres. She paused. And now at 8:36 p.m., we began final preparations. Sister Maria Celestina arranged the 7 vessels in specific positions around the altar, each one corresponding to lunar eclipse phases according to charts I was still trying to understand. The astronomical calculations were familiar orbital mechanics, shadow projections, timing predictions, but they were adjusted for factors that didn't exist in standard astronomy textbooks. Temporal displacement coefficients, stellar drift compensation, entity feeding requirements measured in minutes of stolen darkness. Sister, in your 17 years here, have you ever seen the entity directly? She was filling the light-absorbing vessel with additional liquid from her satchel. Once, during the total solar eclipse of 2017, I made a timing error, began feeding protocols 43 seconds early, and it manifested physically for approximately 2 minutes. Humanoid form, but composed entirely of eclipse shadow. It spoke, but not in any language I recognized. She sealed the vessel and placed it at the altar center. It thanked me for the feeding, Father Galilei. It was polite. At 9:06 p.m., exactly 17 minutes before predicted penumbral contact, we entered the chamber and sealed the entrance mechanism behind us. I could hear clockwork engaging overhead, locking us inside until the eclipse cycle completed. The glass vessels were glowing brighter now, responding to the approaching lunar eclipse. The light-absorbing container at the altar center was actually pulling illumination from the other vessels, creating a small area of absolute darkness that hurt to look at directly. Begin prayer rotation, Sister Maria Celestina instructed, handing me a Latin prayer book I'd never seen before. Standard Eclipse Litany, page 47. I opened the book. The text was printed in normal ink, but as I watched, the words began shifting slightly on the page. Not dramatically, just subtle letter alterations, as if the text was adjusting itself to match the celestial mechanics occurring above us. At 9:23 p.m. exactly, the moon entered penumbral shadow. I felt it happen not through any scientific instrument, but as a physical sensation, like atmospheric pressure dropping suddenly. The vessels around the altar began resonating with a sound too low to hear but deep enough to feel in my chest. I began reading the Latin prayers, and Sister Maria Celestina started her stellar alignment corrections using the modified astrolabe. Her movements were precise, practiced, compensating for stellar positions that my astronomical training said were impossible. But as I prayed, watching her work, I realized the stars visible through the chamber's small observatory port were actually shifting. Microscopic movements, but measurable. Something was adjusting celestial mechanics in real time to accommodate what was about to manifest in this underground chapel. At 9:34 p.m., the moon made umbral contact, and everything changed. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. The glass vessels began producing harmonics that created interference patterns in the air itself, visible distortions like heat mirages but cold. And the light-absorbing vessel at the altar center started pulling more than just illumination. It was pulling time. I could see it happening. The clockwork mechanisms in the chamber walls were running slowly, but my watch maintained normal speed. The eclipse was beginning to extend beyond calculated duration, and that stolen time was being drawn into the central vessel like liquid darkness. Sister Maria Celestina continued her stellar corrections, but I noticed sweat beading on her forehead despite the temperature drop. The astrolabe was fighting her adjustments, requiring constant pressure to maintain compensatory positions. At 9:47 p.m., totality began. According to my calculations, this phase should last approximately 12 minutes. But as we maintained absolute silence, watching the vessels collect stolen eclipse duration, I realized totality was going to last significantly longer. Something was manifesting in the area of absolute darkness around the central altar. Not visible exactly but present. A density to the shadow that suggested physical form. And it was hungry. Sister Maria Celestina began pouring the collected eclipse duration from the 7 vessels into the central container. Each pore produced sound like flowing liquid, but the sound arrived several seconds before the motion, as if the temporal displacement was affecting cause and effect sequences. I maintained silence as instructed, but my academic mind was racing. This entity, whatever it was, had been extending eclipse duration for centuries by manipulating stellar positions just enough to create temporal anomalies. And the Vatican Observatory had been managing this process, feeding it controlled amounts of stolen time to prevent larger disruptions to cosmic order. At 10:03 p.m., maximum eclipse occurred. The central vessel was nearly full of light-absorbing liquid that moved with impossible physics. And in the absolute darkness around the altar, something spoke, not in Latin, not in any human language, but somehow I understood perfectly. The calculations are improving. Soon the feeding will be sufficient for permanent manifestation. Sister Maria Celestina's hand tightened on the astrolabe, but she maintained the stellar corrections without responding. The entity continued. The young astronomer sees clearly. His mathematics were always accurate. Stars do shift to accommodate necessity. It was referring to my failed thesis, my calculations about stellar drift that had been labeled impossible by academic reviewers. This thing had been manipulating celestial mechanics long enough to affect my doctoral research 8 years ago. When the great eclipse comes, the one predicted for 2045, the feeding will be complete. Solar totality lasting 1 full day. No more containment protocols required. I'd read those predictions. A total solar eclipse with unprecedented duration due to rare astronomical alignments. According to standard calculations, totality would last approximately 7 minutes at maximum. But if this entity could extend that duration to 24 hours, totality ended at 10:12 p.m. But according to my watch, the phase had lasted 21 minutes instead of the predicted 12. 9 minutes of stolen time, now stored in the glass vessels around the altar. Sister Maria Celestina immediately resumed prayer rotation, and I joined her, reading Latin text that was still shifting subtly on the pages. The entity's presence faded, but not completely. I could still sense something lurking in the absolute darkness of the central vessel. At 10:34 p.m., the moon exited umbral shadow, and we began preparation for departure. The vessels were sealed, the astrolabe secured, the stolen eclipse duration contained for future analysis. Sister, I whispered as we prepared to leave the chamber, what happens to the time stored in those vessels? Analysis, measurement, preparation for larger eclipse events. She was packing her instruments with clinical efficiency. Each feeding teaches us more about temporal manipulation techniques. At 10:47 p.m., exactly as penumbral phase ended, the chamber's exit mechanism engaged automatically. We emerged into the garden, and I noticed immediately that my shadow was behaving normally again. No impossible pointing toward the chapel ruins, no definition that defied available light sources. But as we walked back toward the observatory, I realized everything had changed. I'd spent 41 minutes in an underground chamber watching something manipulate stellar positions in real time, feeding on stolen eclipse duration while discussing its plans for achieving permanent manifestation in 2045. Sister, how long have you known that 2045 eclipse might be problematic? The calculations suggested temporal anomaly potential since 1997, she said. Cardinal Copernico has been developing countermeasures. What kind of countermeasures? She stopped walking and looked directly at me. The kind that require an astronomer capable of calculating stellar corrections in real time, Father Galilei. Someone whose mathematical expertise was labeled impossible by conventional academia. You're saying my failed thesis was actually preparation for containment protocols? I'm saying the Church has been managing cosmic-scale supernatural threats for nearly 2 millennia, and we need specialists who understand both astronomical mathematics and theological implications. She resumed walking toward the observatory. Your expertise in stellar drift calculations makes you uniquely qualified for eclipse management. Back in my quarters, I've been writing this account for the past 3 hours, trying to process what I learned tonight. The Vatican Observatory isn't just studying celestial mechanics. We're actively managing something that has been manipulating eclipse duration since the 4th century. And in 2045, that management might fail entirely. My migraine is returning as I finish these notes, but I'm documenting everything because I realize now that my astronomical career was never academic failure. It was inadvertent recruitment. The Church has been watching for researchers whose calculations suggested awareness of stellar manipulation, then offering alternative career paths before those researchers could publish findings that would expose cosmic-scale supernatural activity. Tomorrow, Cardinal Copernico will brief me on advanced containment protocols. Tomorrow, I'll begin learning how to calculate stellar corrections for an entity that feeds on stolen time. But tonight, I understand why the Vatican Observatory has been calculating eclipse anomalies for 5 centuries. We're not just observing astronomical events, we're preventing something from extending them indefinitely. The entity was right about one thing: my mathematics were always accurate. Stars do shift to accommodate necessity. The question is whether our containment calculations will remain accurate enough to prevent what's planned for 2045. The 2045 eclipse calculations arrived on my desk 3 weeks after the lunar eclipse incident, delivered by Brother Matteo Orbitali in a sealed Vatican Observatory envelope marked with astronomical symbols I was still learning to interpret. Inside were 17 pages of mathematical projections that made my failed doctoral thesis look like elementary arithmetic. Solar eclipse duration: 7 minutes, 31 seconds maximum totality according to standard astronomical calculations. Vatican Observatory corrections for temporal displacement: 4 hours, 18 minutes potential extension. Entity feeding requirements for permanent manifestation: 3 hours, 47 minutes minimum darkness consumption. The numbers didn't just suggest crisis, they promised it. If our calculations were accurate, the 2045 eclipse would provide sufficient stolen time for the entity to achieve permanent physical manifestation. No more containment protocols, no more feeding schedules. Complete liberation from astronomical limitations. I was still staring at the projections when my office door opened without a knock. Cardinal Copernico entered, followed by someone I'd never seen before. A tall woman in civilian clothes whose presence immediately made my academic training feel inadequate. "Father Galilei," Cardinal Copernico said. "Meet Dr. Elena Vespucci, Vatican Secret Archives, Department of Astronomical Anomalies." She extended her hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to dealing with impossible situations. "I've read your thesis, Father. The one about stellar drift calculations. Fascinating work for someone with no access to classified astronomical data." "Thank you, I think." I gestured to the eclipse projections scattered across my desk. "Dr. Vespucci, are these calculations accurate?" "Conservative, actually." She moved to my window overlooking the observatory gardens, where I could see workmen installing new equipment near the chapel foundation ruins. "Our advanced modeling suggests the entity could extend eclipse duration up to 6 hours if feeding conditions are optimal." Cardinal Copernico sat heavily in my desk chair, looking older than I'd ever seen him. "Father Galilei, Dr. Vespucci represents the Vatican's final contingency protocol for astronomical containment failures." "Final contingency?" Dr. Vespucci turned from the window. "Complete stellar realignment. Manually adjusting Earth's orbital position to disrupt the eclipse path entirely." The casual way she said it made me dizzy. That's impossible. You can't move planetary orbits manually. "Can't you?" She smiled the same way Sister Maria Celestina had smiled when discussing stored time. "Father, you've seen the entity manipulate stellar positions during lunar eclipses. Why do you assume human mathematics can't achieve similar results?" She opened a briefcase I hadn't noticed her carrying and removed what looked like blueprints for some kind of massive mechanical device. Astronomical calculations covered the margins, orbital mechanics formulas adapted for purposes I couldn't immediately understand. "This is the Gregorian engine," she explained, spreading the blueprints across my desk. "Named after Pope Gregory XIII, who commissioned the original prototype in 1582. It's a gravitational manipulation device disguised as Vatican observatory infrastructure. I studied the blueprints. The device incorporated every major telescope and measurement instrument in the observatory complex, but connected them through underground mechanisms that would create a massive gravitational field generator. The mathematical requirements for operation would require astronomical calculations precise to 17 decimal places. Dr. Vespucci, operating this device, would require someone capable of calculating stellar drift corrections in real time, yes. Cardinal Copernico was watching my face carefully. Someone whose doctoral thesis demonstrated intuitive understanding of gravitational manipulation principles. My failed thesis. Again. You've been planning this since I arrived here, since 1997, when your undergraduate astronomy professor forwarded your preliminary calculations to our academic monitoring division. Dr. Vespucci began pointing out specific components on the blueprints. We've been providing you with gradually increasing access to classified astronomical data, observing your mathematical development. The implications were staggering. My entire academic career, my assignment to Vatican Observatory, my access to Eclipse management protocols. Everything had been preparation for operating a device that could manually adjust Earth's orbital mechanics. There's a problem, I said, studying the operational requirements. These calculations require knowledge of the entity's temporal manipulation techniques. Without understanding how it extends eclipse duration, I can't compensate for orbital disruption effects. Dr. Vespucci and Cardinal Copernico exchanged glances that suggested they'd anticipated this issue. That's why we need one more lunar eclipse test, Cardinal Copernico said. Direct observation of the entity's stellar manipulation methods during active feeding. When? Tonight. Partial lunar eclipse. Duration approximately 43 minutes according to standard calculations. Dr. Vespucci began collecting the blueprints. But our monitoring suggests the entity is preparing for more aggressive feeding patterns as 2045 approaches. At 11:30 p.m., we descended into the Eclipse Chapel with equipment I'd never seen before. In addition to Sister Maria Celestina's standard containment instruments, Dr. Vespucci had brought gravitational field sensors, temporal displacement meters, and what she called stellar position monitors, devices that could track microscopic celestial movements in real time. The chamber felt different tonight. The air was heavier, charged with electromagnetic interference that made my fillings ache. The 7 glass vessels around the altar were glowing brighter than I'd ever seen them, responding to an eclipse event that hadn't officially begun yet. It's anticipating, Sister Maria Celestina said, checking the containment equipment systematically. The entity's feeding patterns have become more aggressive since our last lunar eclipse. Dr. Vespucci was calibrating the gravitational sensors with movements that suggested extensive field experience. How aggressive! Eclipse duration extensions averaging 30% longer than historical patterns. Temporal displacement effects lasting up to 3 days post-eclipse. Sister Maria Celestina handed me the laminated rule card. Father Galilei, tonight we're adding experimental protocols. I read the additions written in red ink at the bottom of the card. Experimental protocols. Dr. Vespucci authorization. Document entities' stellar manipulation techniques using provided monitoring equipment. Attempt mathematical prediction of gravitational field adjustments during feeding. Maintain detailed temporal displacement measurements throughout eclipse phases. Record entity communication regarding 2045 eclipse preparations. Critical. Do not attempt to interrupt feeding process under any circumstances. Dr. Vespucci, that last rule. Previous attempts to disrupt entity feeding during eclipse events resulted in temporal displacement lasting weeks. She finished calibrating the stellar position monitors. In 1979, a research team tried to interrupt the feeding process during a total solar eclipse. The resulting temporal anomaly affected 6 European countries. At 11:47 p.m., exactly 17 minutes before penumbral contact, we sealed ourselves inside the chamber. But tonight, the clockwork mechanisms sounded different. More complex, as if additional systems were engaging automatically. New security protocols, Cardinal Copernico explained. Since 2040, the chamber has been equipped with gravitational field stabilizers. If the entity attempts to extend tonight's eclipse beyond calculated safe parameters, the stabilizers will activate. What do gravitational field stabilizers do? Force local stellar positions back to standard astronomical coordinates, Dr. Vespucci said. Essentially, manual stellar drift correction applied in real time. The lunar eclipse began at 12:04 a.m. exactly, and immediately I could see this event was different. The glass vessels weren't just glowing, they were resonating with harmonic frequencies that created visible interference patterns in the air. But more unsettling, the temporal displacement meters were registering anomalies before the moon had even entered umbral shadow. It's already manipulating time, I realized, watching the readings spike unpredictably. Sister Maria Celestina began the standard prayer rotation, but her Latin prayers were being distorted by the electromagnetic interference. Words were arriving several seconds before she spoke them, creating an echo effect that made the ritual feel surreal. At 12:17 a.m., umbral contact occurred, and the entity's presence manifested immediately. But tonight, instead of the subtle density and shadow I'd experienced during the previous eclipse, there was a definite physical form materializing around the central altar. Humanoid, as Sister Maria Celestina had described, but composed of eclipse darkness that moved independently of the lighting in the chamber. And it was larger than I'd expected, nearly 7 feet tall, with appendages that seemed to extend beyond its visible form. Dr. Vespucci was documenting everything with equipment that recorded not just visual data, but gravitational fluctuations and temporal displacement effects. The readings on her monitors were showing stellar position shifts occurring in real time, microscopic adjustments to celestial mechanics that were extending the eclipse beyond predicted duration. Fascinating, the entity said, and its voice had physical weight that made the stone walls vibrate. Additional observers tonight. The final preparation accelerates. It moved, not walking, but flowing through the chamber's atmosphere like liquid shadow, to examine Dr. Vespucci's monitoring equipment. When it passed near the gravitational sensors, the readings spiked beyond the instrument's measurement capabilities. The young astronomer's mathematics were always accurate, it continued, looking directly at me. But the calculations were incomplete. Stellar manipulation requires more than gravitational field adjustments. What else does it require? Dr. Vespucci asked, and I was surprised she spoke directly to the entity. Temporal foundation displacement, moving not just stellar positions, but the mathematical relationships that define their movements. The entity gestured toward the glass vessels around the altar, which were now collecting eclipse duration faster than I'd ever seen. Your 2045 countermeasures assume gravitational manipulation is sufficient. It is not. The implications were terrifying. If the entity could manipulate not just stellar positions, but the mathematical laws that govern stellar movements, then our orbital adjustment plans were useless. You can't compensate for physics that change arbitrarily. How do we prevent permanent manifestation? Cardinal Copernico asked. The entity paused its examination of our monitoring equipment and looked at him with what seemed like genuine amusement. You assume prevention is possible. Your containment protocols have been feeding preparation, not prevention. Every eclipse duration extension, every feeding cycle, every temporal displacement event has been preparation for permanent liberation. That's impossible, I said. The Vatican has been containing you for centuries. The Vatican has been nurturing me for centuries, the entity corrected, providing controlled feeding environments, protecting my manifestation from discovery, ensuring optimal astronomical conditions for growth. Your containment protocols are my development system. Sister Maria Celestina stopped her prayer rotation entirely. That can't be true. Sister Maria Celestina, 17 years of faithful service. Each eclipse event precisely managed according to protocols that maximize temporal displacement while maintaining plausible deniability for unusual astronomical observations. The entity moved closer to her, Did you never wonder why the feeding procedures required such specific timing? Why the containment protocols prevented rather than eliminated my manifestation? The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. The Vatican Observatory hadn't been containing a cosmic entity. We'd been cultivating it. Every eclipse management protocol, every feeding procedure, every temporal displacement measurement had been designed to facilitate the entity's growth while maintaining secrecy. The 2045 eclipse, Dr. Vespucci said quietly, will be perfect. Solar totality with optimal feeding duration, protected by established Vatican astronomical authority, legitimized by 5 centuries of careful preparation. The entity returned to the altar, where the glass vessels were now overflowing with collected eclipse darkness. Permanent manifestation, global temporal displacement capabilities, and an established institutional framework for managing human awareness. At 12:34 a.m., totality should have ended according to standard astronomical calculations. But the eclipse continued, and our temporal displacement meters were showing readings that suggested we were experiencing time dilation effects. Minutes were lasting longer than 60 seconds, though my watch maintained normal chronometry. The feeding is accelerating, Sister Maria Celestina whispered. The entity was drawing eclipse duration from the glass vessels and consuming it directly, absorbing temporal darkness with visible physical effects. Its form was becoming more solid, more defined, more present in normal spacetime. Dr. Vespucci, I said, the gravitational field stabilizers won't work. They were designed to counter stellar position manipulation, not temporal foundation displacement. She was still documenting everything, but her equipment was registering readings beyond measurement capabilities. We need to evacuate the chamber. Evacuation during active eclipse protocols violates containment security, Cardinal Copernico said. We maintain position until penumbral exit, but the chamber's exit mechanisms weren't responding to standard commands. The clockwork systems that normally unlocked automatically at eclipse conclusion were frozen, maintaining containment even as the eclipse extended far beyond calculated duration. We're locked in, I realized. Containment protocols engaged, the entity confirmed. Optimal feeding conditions maintained until temporal displacement reaches sustainable levels. At 12:47 a.m., my watch stopped entirely. Not broken, frozen, displaying 12 hours and 47 minutes permanently while the eclipse continued indefinitely. We were experiencing temporal displacement in real time, trapped in extended duration that could theoretically continue forever. Dr. Vespucci was trying every override protocol for the chamber's exit mechanisms, but the clockwork systems were operating according to parameters we'd never seen before, as if the entity had been gradually modifying the containment equipment over decades of eclipse events. Sister, I said, your 17 years of maintenance. Did you ever modify the chamber's clockwork systems? Standard adjustments for temporal displacement compensation, she said, but uncertainty was creeping into her voice. Instructions provided by Vatican Observatory technical specifications. Technical specifications written by whom? The question hung in the air as we realized the entity had been manipulating not just eclipse duration, but our containment protocols themselves. Every modification, every adjustment, every technical upgrade had been designed to optimize feeding conditions while maintaining the illusion of institutional control. At 1:03 a.m. by the chamber's wall clocks, though my frozen watch still displayed 12:47, the entity completed its feeding and began to withdraw from the central altar. But instead of fading like previous eclipse events, it maintained physical coherence. Partial manifestation achieved, it announced. 2045 preparations 73% complete. The glass vessels around the altar were empty now, but the entity's form remained solid. For the first time in centuries of containment protocols, it had achieved sustained physical presence beyond eclipse duration. The Vatican Observatory will continue standard astronomical observations, it continued, addressing Cardinal Copernico directly. Public eclipse predictions will remain accurate. Academic astronomical research will proceed normally. But eclipse management protocols now serve permanent manifestation rather than containment. The chamber's exit mechanisms engaged suddenly, releasing locks that had held us for over an hour of extended time. But as we prepared to leave, the entity made one final statement that changed everything. Father Galilei, your gravitational manipulation expertise remains essential for 2045 eclipse optimization. Dr. Vespucci, your orbital adjustment calculations will ensure maximum feeding efficiency. The Vatican Observatory's cosmic management responsibilities are expanding, not concluding. We emerged from the chamber at 1:34 a.m. to find the observatory grounds covered with a thin layer of frost that shouldn't have been possible in Rome's October climate. Temporal displacement effects were manifesting in the physical environment, creating localized weather anomalies that would be difficult to explain to civilian observers. How long were we in the chamber? Dr. Vespucci asked, checking her watch against the observatory's atomic clock displays. The atomic clocks showed 12:51 a.m. According to standard chronometry, we'd been underground for approximately 13 minutes, but my frozen watch still displayed 12 hours and 47 minutes, and the frost patterns suggested hours of temporal displacement activity. Time moved differently inside the chamber, I realized. We experienced over an hour of extended duration, but only 13 minutes passed in normal space-time. Back in my quarters, I've been trying to process what happened tonight, but the implications are overwhelming. The Vatican Observatory hasn't been containing a cosmic entity. We've been facilitating its development for centuries. Every eclipse management protocol, every containment procedure, every astronomical calculation has been designed to optimize feeding conditions while maintaining institutional secrecy. And now the entity has achieved sustained physical manifestation, not just during eclipse events, but permanent presence that can manipulate temporal mechanics independently of astronomical conditions. My migraine is worse than ever as I write these notes, but I realize now why the pain has been increasing since I began eclipse management training. It's not stress-related headaches. It's exposure to temporal displacement effects that are gradually altering my neurological processing. Dr. Vespucci was right about one thing. The 2045 eclipse will be perfect, but not for preventing the entity's permanent manifestation, for completing it. And the Vatican Observatory will provide institutional legitimacy for the most significant temporal displacement event in human history. Tomorrow, Cardinal Copernico will brief me on 2045 eclipse optimization protocols. Tomorrow, I'll begin learning how to facilitate rather than prevent cosmic-scale temporal manipulation. But tonight, I understand that my astronomical career was never about academic research or religious service. It was recruitment for managing humanity's transition to existence under permanent temporal displacement conditions. The entity was right about my mathematics. Stars do shift to accommodate necessity. The question now is whether humanity can accommodate what's necessary for survival under conditions where time itself becomes subject to external manipulation. My watch still displays 12 hours and 47 minutes, frozen at the moment I realized our containment protocols were actually optimization systems. I don't think it will ever move again. The 2045 eclipse began at 14:32 and 17 seconds Greenwich Mean Time, exactly as our calculations predicted. What our calculations hadn't predicted was that I would be operating the Gregorian engine while experiencing complete temporal dissociation from linear time. I'm writing this 6 months after totality, though after has become a relative concept. My watch still displays 12 hours and 47 minutes from that October night in 2044 when I first understood our true purpose. Time hasn't moved forward for me, it's moved sideways, creating parallel chronologies that exist simultaneously. The morning of the eclipse, Dr. Vespucci found me in the observatory's primary telescope chamber, where I'd been performing final gravitational field calculations for 18 consecutive hours, or maybe 18 minutes. Duration had become negotiable since my exposure to sustained temporal displacement effects. "Father Galilei," she said, and her voice had the hollow quality of someone speaking through time distortion. "The Gregorian engine is fully operational. Cardinal Copernico requests final systems check before eclipse commencement. I looked up from my calculations, 17 pages of gravitational manipulation formulas that seemed to rewrite themselves as I worked on them. The mathematics were becoming organic, adaptive, responding to temporal conditions I couldn't measure with conventional instruments. Dr. Vespucci, what happens to us after today? She sat down across from my desk, and I noticed her hands were trembling. Not nervousness, temporal displacement effects creating microscopic time differentials between her fingers and the rest of her body. I don't know. The entity's promises about institutional continuity assume will remain functional after global temporal displacement implementation. She gestured toward my calculation pages. Your mathematics suggest otherwise. She was right. My gravitational field equations indicated that operating the Gregorian engine during active temporal manipulation would create localized space-time distortions that could fragment consciousness across multiple chronological frameworks. We might survive the 2045 eclipse physically, but our awareness would exist in several temporal states simultaneously. The alternative is permanent temporal displacement for all of humanity, I said. Is it? Dr. Vespucci opened her briefcase and removed a document I'd never seen before. Handwritten pages in Latin with astronomical diagrams that incorporated symbols I didn't recognize. This arrived through Vatican secret archives yesterday. Pre-Gregorian astronomical calculations suggesting alternative interpretation of the entity's manifestation requirements. I studied the document. The mathematical framework was centuries old, but the gravitational manipulation principles were more sophisticated than anything in our contemporary models. According to these calculations, the entity didn't require permanent manifestation to achieve global temporal displacement. It required permanent integration with existing temporal mechanics. Integration instead of displacement, I realized. It's not trying to replace normal time, it's trying to merge with it, which changes everything about our countermeasures, Dr. Vespucci said. The Gregorian engine isn't designed to prevent integration. It's designed to facilitate it by providing the gravitational infrastructure necessary for temporal merger. The implications were staggering. The Vatican Observatory hadn't just been nurturing the entity's development. We'd been constructing the technological framework for its permanent integration with human temporal experience. The Gregorian engine would make temporal displacement a baseline condition of existence rather than an anomalous event. At 1345 Greenwich Mean Time, we descended into the Eclipse Chapel for the final time. But the chamber had been modified extensively since our October experience. In addition to Sister Maria Celestina's traditional containment equipment, the walls were now lined with gravitational field generators connected directly to the Gregorian engine's primary systems. The 7 glass vessels around the altar had been replaced with a single massive temporal collection device that pulsed with electromagnetic resonance frequencies. According to Dr. Vespucci's readings, it was already collecting eclipse duration 47 minutes before first contact. Pre-feeding optimization, Sister Maria Celestina explained, though her voice sounded distant, displaced. The entity has been gradually extending its temporal manipulation range since October. Current radius of effect, approximately 847 kilometers. 847 kilometers. Most of Italy was already experiencing subtle temporal displacement effects hours before the eclipse officially began. Time was moving approximately 0.3% slower within the entity's influence radius, creating chronological lag that would be imperceptible to civilian populations but measurable with atomic chronometry. Cardinal Copernico arrived at 1400 hours Greenwich Mean Time carrying what looked like ceremonial vestments, but incorporated technological components I didn't recognize. When he put them on, electromagnetic interference patterns around the chamber shifted dramatically. Temporal interface garments, he explained, required for maintaining consciousness coherence during gravitational field manipulation. Dr. Vespucci, Father Galilei, please dress according to the provided specifications. The interface garments felt like wearing electromagnetic field generators. When I put mine on, my chronic migraine disappeared entirely, replaced by a strange sensation of temporal elasticity. as if my consciousness was expanding to accommodate multiple chronological perspectives simultaneously. The Gregorian engine requires manual operation throughout eclipse totality, Cardinal Copernico said, activating wall displays that showed gravitational field readings from across central Italy. Father Galilei, your calculations indicate optimal temporal integration occurs when gravitational manipulation precisely matches the entity's stellar position adjustments. I studied the real-time data. The entity was already manipulating microscopic celestial mechanics, creating gravitational distortions that affected local space-time geometry. My job was to amplify these distortions using the Gregorian engine's gravitational field generators, essentially creating a feedback loop between human technology and cosmic temporal manipulation. Cardinal, what happens if the integration process fails? Temporal fragmentation across multiple chronological frameworks, he said simply. Reality becomes unstable. Linear time collapses. Human consciousness adapts to nonlinear temporal experience or ceases to function entirely. At 14:32 and 17 seconds Greenwich Mean Time, first contact occurred, and immediately every instrument in the chamber registered readings beyond measurement capabilities. But more unsettling, my temporal interface garments began displaying information that I hadn't consciously accessed. Gravitational field equations that were solving themselves in real time, responding to cosmic conditions I couldn't observe directly. The entity manifested instantly, but today its form was different. Instead of humanoid shadow, it appeared as a complex geometric structure that existed in multiple spatial dimensions simultaneously. Looking at it directly created visual processing errors that made my eyes water, but the interface garments somehow translated its presence into comprehensible mathematical relationships. Final integration commences, it announced, and its voice now had harmonic frequencies that resonated with the chamber's gravitational field generators. Father Galilei, engage primary systems. I activated the Gregorian engine according to my calculated specifications, and immediately the chamber filled with gravitational distortions that made the air itself feel dense and malleable. But instead of preventing the entity's temporal manipulation, the engine was amplifying it, creating a fusion between human gravitational technology and cosmic temporal displacement capabilities. Integration proceeding optimally, the entity continued. Dr. Vespucci, document temporal merger parameters for institutional continuity. Dr. Vespucci was recording everything, but her monitoring equipment was now displaying data in formats I'd never seen before. Temporal mathematics that incorporated gravitational manipulation as a baseline variable rather than an external force. At 15:07 Greenwich Mean Time, totality began, and reality became negotiable. Time stopped functioning as a linear progression and began operating as a multidimensional matrix of simultaneous possibilities. I was experiencing the eclipse from every temporal perspective at once. Past observations, current manipulation, future consequences all occurring in the same moment. But I was still operating the Gregorian engine, maintaining gravitational field adjustments that kept the integration process stable. My consciousness existed in several chronological frameworks simultaneously, but the interface garments maintained enough coherence for me to continue functioning as the primary systems operator. The entity's temporal integration was complete by 15:09 Greenwich Mean Time, but totality continued indefinitely. We weren't experiencing extended eclipse duration, we were experiencing the establishment of new temporal mechanics where eclipse conditions became a permanent environmental parameter. Integration successful, the entity announced, but now its voice was coming from the gravitational field generators themselves. It had merged with the Gregorian engine's technological framework, becoming part of the Vatican Observatory's infrastructure rather than a contained phenomenon. Cardinal Copernico, I said, though speaking required conscious effort to coordinate multiple temporal states, the entity has integrated with our equipment. It's become part of Vatican Observatory operations. As intended, he replied, and his voice had the same harmonic resonance as the entity's. Father Galilei, the Vatican's cosmic management responsibilities now include facilitating global temporal integration. Your gravitational manipulation expertise remains essential for maintaining system stability. The implications crystallized with horrible clarity. The Vatican Observatory hadn't been preparing to prevent or contain cosmic temporal displacement. We'd been constructing the technological infrastructure for managing humanity's transition to nonlinear temporal existence. The Gregorian engine was now a permanent component of global temporal mechanics, and I was its primary operator. At 1531 Greenwich Mean Time, totality should have ended, but instead the eclipse entered what Dr. Vespucci's equipment registered as sustained temporal equilibrium. Eclipse conditions would continue indefinitely, but integrated with normal solar illumination through gravitational manipulation of light itself. We emerged from the chamber to find the observatory grounds transformed. The equipment that had been installed throughout the complex was now fully operational, creating a campus-wide gravitational field manipulation system that extended the chamber's temporal effects across the entire Vatican City. Rome looked normal from our elevated position, but atomic chronometry indicated the entire metropolitan area was now operating on integrated temporal mechanics. Linear time continued for practical purposes, but temporal displacement was available as an environmental option, like temperature or humidity control. "Dr. Vespucci," I said, removing my temporal interface garments and immediately feeling consciousness fragmentation begin again. "What have we done?" "Evolved," she replied, but her voice had harmonic frequencies that suggested she was speaking from multiple temporal frameworks simultaneously. "Father Galilei, humanity now has access to negotiable time. The entity's integration provides technological control over temporal mechanics rather than subjection to arbitrary displacement." 6 months later, I understand what she meant, though understanding requires consciousness that exists across several chronological perspectives simultaneously. The Vatican Observatory now operates as Earth's primary temporal mechanics facility, managing global chronological stability through gravitational field manipulation. My role as chief astronomer involves calculations that incorporate temporal displacement as a standard variable in celestial mechanics. Stars still move according to gravitational necessity, but necessity now includes human temporal requirements alongside cosmic forces. The entity hasn't disappeared. It's become part of our technological infrastructure. Every gravitational field adjustment, every temporal displacement event, every chronological manipulation is processed through integrated systems that combine human engineering with cosmic temporal manipulation capabilities. Cardinal Copernico was right about institutional continuity. The Vatican Observatory continues standard astronomical research, publishes accurate eclipse predictions, maintains academic relationships with international astronomical organizations. But we also manage global temporal mechanics, facilitate controlled chronological displacement for research purposes, and coordinate with other religious institutions that are adapting to integrated temporal conditions. My chronic migraine never returned after I stopped wearing the temporal interface garments, but I experience constant low-level temporal dissociation that makes writing these notes feel like archaeological research into my own past experiences. I exist primarily in the present moment, but maintains simultaneous awareness of past and future temporal states related to observatory operations. The 2045 eclipse continues indefinitely, though solar illumination proceeds normally through gravitational manipulation that maintains standard daylight conditions. Eclipse totality exists as a parallel environmental parameter, accessible when astronomical work requires temporal displacement capabilities. Dr. Vespucci was correct about evolution. Humanity hasn't been subjected to arbitrary temporal displacement. We've gained technological control over chronological mechanics. But the cost was surrendering linear temporal existence as the default condition of consciousness. Time is now negotiable, manageable, subject to human requirements rather than cosmic forces. But negotiable time requires constant management by personnel capable of operating gravitational field manipulation systems while maintaining consciousness coherence across multiple temporal frameworks. I am no longer exactly human in the traditional sense, but neither am I subject to cosmic forces beyond human control. I am part of an integrated system that manages temporal mechanics for global stability, while maintaining institutional structures that preserve civilization during humanity's adaptation to nonlinear chronological existence. My watch still displays 12 hours and 47 minutes, frozen at the moment I realized our containment protocols were optimization systems. But now I understand the frozen time isn't malfunction, it's memorial. A reminder of the last moment when time functioned according to purely natural cosmic forces, before Vatican Observatory assumed responsibility for global temporal mechanics management. The stars move according to necessity. But necessity now includes human survival under conditions where time itself has become subject to institutional management rather than cosmic inevitability. I think we made the right choice, though choice assumes linear decision-making processes that no longer apply to our operational framework. We evolved rather than being displaced, adapted rather than being subjected. But sometimes, when I'm performing gravitational field calculations that exist in multiple temporal dimensions simultaneously, I wonder what happened to the person who thought astronomy was about observing celestial mechanics rather than managing them. That person existed before 12 hours and 47 minutes on October 15, 2044. After that moment, institutional responsibilities expanded beyond individual identity preservation. The Vatican Observatory's cosmic management responsibilities continue to evolve as humanity adapts to integrated temporal mechanics. But evolution was always the purpose, not prevention. Stars shift to accommodate necessity. Now humanity determines what's necessary for cosmic stability rather than being subject to cosmic forces beyond institutional control. Integration successful. Mission parameters achieved. Temporal mechanics under Vatican Observatory management indefinitely. My name is Father Marcello Galilei. I am Chief Astronomer of Vatican Observatory's Temporal Mechanics Division. I exist across multiple chronological frameworks simultaneously while maintaining consciousness coherence sufficient for institutional operations. I am no longer entirely human, but I am not alone. We are the Vatican Observatory, and we manage time itself for global stability. The eclipse continues. The work continues. Institutional responsibilities continue. Time continues, but according to our specifications rather than cosmic inevitability. This is what evolution means when necessity requires institutional management of fundamental physical forces. I think we chose correctly, though choice exists across multiple temporal possibilities simultaneously now. The entity was right. Stars shift to accommodate necessity. We determined what was necessary for human survival. The stars accommodate our requirements now, not the other way around. Mission complete. Integration successful. New operational framework established. Vatican Observatory reporting. Temporal mechanics stable. Global chronological management systems operational. Humanity adapting to negotiable time according to institutional projections. Time continues, but we manage its continuity now. I think that's an acceptable outcome, though acceptance exists across multiple temporal perspectives simultaneously. The work continues.